Let's take a look into the modern science classroom. As you can see, we have 30 identical desks arranged in rows facing the front of the classroom. Teacher comes to the front of the classroom and states, "Today we'll be learning about the scientific method, an idea that has been drilled into our heads year after year." We could likely go into to another science classroom down the hall and see the exact same thing. Students relatively unengaged and bored with their daily science learning. This is an issue and a problem that we see in the majority of science classrooms around our nation.
These observations lead us to ask questions such as, why do so many students have a lack of interest in the scientific field? And why do so many students who graduate high school not enter the scientific field? And then in addition to that, why do so many students who do enter the scientific field leave after a short number of years? We find that in the classroom, students find science relatively unengaging, uncreative, uncollaborative, and plain old boring. Students have this view of science as cut and dry and by the book. It involves countless memorization skills, memorizing vocabulary and systems, and regurgitating that information back to a teacher in the form of an assessment. Basically, science is for those students who actually enjoyed AP Physics and enjoyed it and learned it. But what if we were to tell you that all of you could be scientists? You probably think that we were crazy, but why? You see, the issues regarding science aren't within the subject itself, but instead the way that it's taught and portrayed to students in a way that is counterintuitive to the way that we actually learn best. Throughout our general education classrooms, we pick up a majority of misconceptions. And these misconceptions actually prevent and inhibit us from the way that we're actually supposed to see science in the classroom. The core idea being presented today is that science can be taught in a way that is creative, that is collaborative, that is engaging, but most importantly, that is authentic, allowing students to fully understand how science exists in the real world. This is best done through the use of the nature of science, which are a set of key ideas and principles that describe science as a way of knowing, and in different instructional teaching practices, so students will finally have that authentic view of science inside the classroom.
So let's compare the modern classroom to one of the early 1900s. As we can see, there's not a whole lot of change. So it begs the question, how do we modernize our classrooms? Well, the current remedy is to incorporate the use of more electronic technology. But what we end up with is the same instructional strategies, only now students are looking at computer screens as opposed to their textbooks. This is an issue, as students are missing out on valuable social interaction and critical thinking experiences needed for deeper and long-lasting learning. In fact, we know that when students are inappropriately educated in STEM ideas, they gain misconceptions about science and technology. So it begs the question, how do we teach students to become more socially inept? Students need to understand, what is technology? How does technology relate to society? And how can technology even shape human behavior? We know that students learn through modeled practice, but teachers must also have students explicitly reflect on their own thinking and understanding, and ask questions that target their misconceptions about science and technology.
In order to best engage students in instruction, it's important that we have students oriented in groups in classrooms so that the emphasis is on collaboration, like actual scientists. Students have a view that science is highly uncollaborative, where it involves scientists working long hours late at night in a laboratory by themselves. For the most part, this isn't the case. All over in the scientific community, we find scientists working together, collaborating, working off of each other's work. They have this view that science, like I said, is uncollaborative, and we need to change that in the classrooms. Schools and students should be oriented in group work, emphasizing students to work together, to build off of each other, and ask each other questions. In order to best do this, we talk about historical examples in science of when students or when actual scientists were collaborative. One common example is in genetics. We learned about Watson and Crick, two scientists who actually worked together to discover the structure of DNA. In that in itself, we see collaboration, two scientists, Watson and Crick. But in addition to that, we find another number of scientists who actually helped them reach that point. We learn about Rosalind Franklin and the use of crystallography to build the structure of DNA, and Erwin Chargaff, who understood that nitrogenous base pairs existed in equal amounts. By building off these previous scientists, Watson and Crick were able to come up with the structure of DNA. By explicitly teaching about collaboration in the history of science, students have a more authentic view. But in addition to that, students should also be explicitly taught through activities that involve them being collaborative. They should engage with one another, developing experiments together, involving each other and asking each other questions of times when they can see when they were collaborative in the classrooms.
So now we have the ideal learning environment for students, but there's still a problem. Learning about science still isn't engaging. Students think that science is uncreative, which is a problem. And it begs the question, where do students get this misconception? Well, when they're not taking notes through lecture or reading out of the textbook, they'll occasionally do a lab, perhaps mixing two liquids to form a precipitate. But students are following the steps of a worksheet and look more like robots than actual scientists. Students are taught that there is one way to do science. Follow the scientific method. It's important that students understand that there have been many scientific discoveries that have not utilized a step-by-step process. They need to understand that science is actually more organic, that scientists have the freedom to engage in science in whatever way they see fit, to learn about nature in a way that is more realistic and more constructive to their own purposes. Engaging students in creative science activities can best be done by allowing students to ask their own questions, to allow them to create their own discoveries, and to allow them to publish their understandings and learnings in a variety of ways.
Going off of that, creativity needs to be a key part of the scientific classroom. Students generally have this view that creativity is not in science at all, that scientists are highly uncreative, but this isn't true as we found. That means that in the classroom you need to teach about historical examples of when scientists were creative. One great example is talking about how did scientists discover what's at the center of the Earth. Of course, now we understand that this is full of molten rock, but how did scientists figure that out? It's extremely difficult to run experiments on the center of the Earth, considering that it's impossible to go there. So how did scientists figure this out? Scientists need to develop models and make inferences and use their imagination and be creative to find ways of how they can guess or best make an assumption about what is at the center of the Earth. Students also need to do this in the classroom by engaging in activities when they can be creative. They need to form their own experiments. They need to ask their own questions and then decide in groups how should we best interpret the evidence and communicate these results, whether that be through the use of a poster, through a research project, or through a presentation. Students must be creative in the classroom in order to believe that scientists are creative and make those connections that they are creative and they are like scientists.
Students are taught that science is based upon empirical evidence, meaning we gain an understanding through our observations and our inferences. They memorize facts and formulas discovered by great giant scientific geniuses, and they are taught that these ideas are absolute, that they are well accepted and fully accepted by everyone in the science community. This is incorrect. In fact, science is based upon observations and inferences of people with a variety of background knowledge and different perspectives on the world. Students need to understand that scientists, while they try and be objective, they cannot, or they are naturally biased in their inferences on particular observations. Let's take a look at this Gestalt picture. A teacher may be able to use such an image in an activity to allow students to see the differences in their own thinking. A teacher could ask, what shapes do you see in this image? What image do these shapes make up? What evidence do you have that this is a duck? What evidence do you have that this is a rabbit? How does your perception change the way you see? Why are you positive that this image is of an animal? Through having students identify their own differences in thinking, students can relate this knowledge to how scientists and how all of mankind has a natural tendency to be biased due to their background knowledge and due to their perception on the world. Teachers can use this as a decontextualized activity, which allows students to relate their own experiences to that of scientists. However, teachers cannot teach science content through such an activity. Rather, they can use this to relate to other more contextualized learning.
The final tenet we'll kind of talk about is the tentative nature of science. Students have the misconception that science is a highly, an absolute field, that once something's discovered, it stays that way, that it's never questioned and it's absolute. However, this can be true sometimes, it's mostly not true. Continually, science is improved by the discoveries of new people and the reinterpretation of old evidence. But students have these misconceptions that isn't true. That's why it's important in the classroom that we emphasize the history of science and how scientists have tentative ideas and things in science. A couple of great examples to do this are through the mentality that at one point humans used to believe that everything centered around the Earth, that everything orbited around us. We know now today that that's not true, but at one time that was accepted, and that was the belief. Through the introduction of new evidence and new investigations, this idea was challenged and changed. The idea was introduced that everything revolved around the sun, and we've come to understand that today as well. That was never, I'm sure that was questioned at that time, but today we don't question that. So a more recent example is the use of Pluto. Many people understood that this was the 9th planet in our solar system. And when it was introduced that that shouldn't be true, that thinking was incorrect, that it should be now considered a dwarf planet, as you can see, society kind of had a backlash to it. They reacted not positively. But why? Science is always changing. There's always new things introduced, evidence reinterpreted, things that make ideas change and makes people think differently. If students and the general public have a more informed view of authentic science, such as how it can be tentative, things like this, like Pluto not being named a planet anymore instead of dwarf planet, will not be reacted to negatively. People will understand that science can be tentative and can change sometimes, while also being durable at the same time.
Our research shows that not only do students have misconceptions about science and technology, but that their misconceptions are being reinforced by the current instructional methods being used in our classrooms. This begs the question, why are teachers hesitant to incorporate these new instructional strategies as well as incorporate nature of science content? Mitch and I, over several years, gathered some research to see what are some factors that inhibit first-year teachers from actually teaching science well. We found four factors to be extremely inhibitory. The first, that there's a lack of institutional momentum to change the way that we see science. Two, teachers themselves have a lack of motivation for teaching a nature of science content in addition to the content that they already feel they're forced to teach. Three, students are resistant to this style of learning as they've been stuck in the system for so long, and they only have counterexamples to how science is creative, collaborative, and engaging. And lastly, teachers nowadays even now have misconceptions about these topics. Teachers must be prepared to teach science effectively by utilizing these strategies and incorporating nature of science into their classroom.
In addition to that, we also conducted a study that looked at what was the best possible way to express the nature of science through activities. A few ways to do that are through historical short stories as well as black box activities, which are highly decontextualized activities that are completely separate from the scientific field. And what we found was that there were more general and specific nature of science instances through instruction in historical short stories. But what the issue was that students weren't engaged with the stories. Contrary to that, with black box activities, students were very engaged and very excited to solve these problems, to solve these puzzles. But it was extremely hard to have students focus on nature of science activities and nature of science tenets within it. What we found is that the two need to work together. That you first should teach a historical short story to introduce students to the subject of the nature of science, and then use the black box activity to help teach that and engage students in nature of science. Students can be taught in a way that is creative, collaborative, engaging, and authentic in science, allowing them to fully understand what authentic science truly is in the world. By doing this, student interest in science will increase, as well as more people will enter the field of science. In addition to that, more people in the community will have a more generalized and more rational view of science and be able to make more rational decisions regarding topics such as global warming, evolution, and other controversial science issues. Again, students, in order to enter the field of science, need to have an authentic view of science in the classroom. and the only way to do this is to teach authentic science. Thank you.